Now then, the clerk will now... Oh no, we've got first of all, we're going to have the first of our statements, and the first statement is on NATO. So I would now like to call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I start, I would like to pay a short tribute to President Byrne, a man who, during 5 decades of service, never lost touch with the concerns of working people and always put his country first. A true friend of the Labour movement, his presidency will leave a legacy that extends far beyond America to freedom and security on this continent. Most of all, of course, in our steadfast resolve to stand by the people of Ukraine. He leaves the NATO alliance stronger than it's been for decades. And with permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on my recent discussions with leaders around the world, including at the NATO summit and the meeting of the European political community last week at Blenheim Palace, the biggest European summit in the UK since the war. Mr. Speaker, the House knows the significance of Blenheim Palace, the birthplace of Winston Churchill, the man who steered the march of European history towards democracy and the rule of law, a shared sacrifice for freedom, the blood bond of 1945. And, Mr. Speaker, at both of these summits, we reaffirmed our commitment to that bond of security and freedom, as I'm sure we do in this House today. NATO is the guarantor of those values, and it is more important than ever because, Mr. Speaker, today in Europe, innocent lives are once again being torn apart. 2 weeks ago today, an attack on a children's hospital in Kyiv. Children with cancer, the target of Russian brutality. And, Mr. Speaker, Russia's malign activity is not confined to Ukraine. In the Western Balkans, in Moldova, in Georgia, they are sowing instability. And let us not forget, they have targeted people in our streets, attempted to undermine our democracy. And so, Mr. Speaker, in the first days of this government, I have taken a message to our friends and allies of enduring and unwavering commitment to the NATO alliance, to Ukraine, to the collective security of our country, our continent, and our allies around the world. Mr. Speaker, that message was just as relevant at the EPC last week. And can I take this opportunity to thank the Leader of the Opposition who brought that event to our shores in the first place. Mr. Speaker, at these meetings, I took a practical view of how the UK can meet this moment, not driven by ideology, but by what is best for our country. That includes resetting our relationship with the EU, because on these benches, we believe that the UK and the EU, working together as sovereign partners, are a powerful force for good across our continent. That has been my message throughout the many conversations I've had with leaders in recent days. Because, Mr. Speaker, countries want to work with Britain. Of course they do. They welcome renewed British leadership on security, on illegal migration, on global challenges like climate change. Our voice belongs in the room, centre stage, fighting for the national interest. And, Mr. Speaker, my conversations have focused on issues where the British people want action. So I'd like to update the House on my discussions in 3 specific areas. First, European security. In Washington, I told NATO allies that the generational threat from Russia demands a generational response. And that's why my honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will set out a clear path to spending 2.5% of our GDP on defence. It's also why I launched a strategic defence review, led by the former NATO Secretary-General Lord Robertson, to strengthen our armed forces and keep our nation safe. I also took the opportunity at the NATO summit to confirm that we will deliver £3 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine each year for as long as it takes. And together we confirmed Ukraine's irreversible path to full NATO membership. Because it is clear to me that NATO will be stronger with Ukraine as a member, something I reiterated to President Zelensky in person in Downing Street on Friday. Second, I want to turn to the Middle East, because, Mr. Speaker, that region is at the moment in grave danger and fragility. And so I've spoken to leaders in the region and allies around the world about our collective response. How can we deal with the malign influence of Iran, address their nuclear programme, manage the threat from the Houthis, ease tension on Israel's northern border, and work with all partners to uphold regional security? Fundamental to this, of course, is the conflict in Gaza. I've spoken to the leaders of Israel and the Palestinian Authority. I've been clear that I fully support Israel's right to security, the desperate need to see the hostages returned. And I've also been clear that the situation in Gaza is intolerable and that the world will not look away as innocent civilians, including women and children, continue to face death, disease and displacement. Mr. Speaker, it cannot go on. We need an immediate ceasefire. Hostages out, aid in, a huge scale-up of humanitarian assistance. That is the policy of this government, and an immediate ceasefire is the only way to achieve it. So we will do all we can in pursuit of these goals, which is why, as one of the first actions taken by this government, we have restarted British funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency to deliver that crucial humanitarian support. Mr. Speaker, we received the ICJ opinion on Friday and will consider it carefully before responding. But let me say that we've also always been opposed to the expansion of illegal settlements, and we call on all sides to recommit to stability, peace and normalisation, and the two-state solution. A recognised Palestinian state, the right of the Palestinian people, alongside a safe and secure Israel. Third, Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to illegal migration. This issue has now become a crisis, and to tackle it, we must reach out the hand to our European friends. We started that work at the EPC, agreeing new arrangements with Slovenia and Slovakia, deepening cooperation across Europe through our new Border Security Command, and increasing the UK presence at Europol in The Hague, to play our full part in the European Migrant Smuggling Centre. Mr. Speaker, the crisis we face is the fault of gangs, no question. But to stop illegal migration, we must also recognise the root causes: conflict, climate change, extreme poverty. So I've announced £84 million of new funding for projects across Africa and the Middle East, humanitarian and health support, skills training and access to education. Because the decisions people take to leave their homes cannot be separated from these wider issues. Mr. Speaker, we will work with our partners to stamp out this vile trade wherever it exists, focus on the hard yards of law enforcement with solutions that will actually deliver results. I've seen this in action, tackling counter-terrorism as Director of Public Prosecutions, and we can do the same on illegal migration. But let me be clear, there is no need to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. That is not consistent with the values of that blood bond, and so we won't withdraw, not now, not ever. Because, Mr. Speaker, the basic fact is the priorities of the British people do require us to work across borders with our partners. And a government of service at home requires a government of strength abroad. That is our role. It's always been our role. Britain belongs on the world stage, and I commend this statement to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Rishi Sunak.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and join him by praising President Biden for his long career of public service, both at home and abroad. Working together, we took our AUKUS partnership to the next level. We supported Israel after the terrible events of October the 7th, defended our countries from the Houthi threat, but also led global efforts to support Ukraine as it resisted Russia's assault. On a personal level, it was a pleasure to work with him to strengthen the partnership between our two countries, and I wish him well. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister indicated, the world is increasingly uncertain, the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War. Russia continues its illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine. Iran continues with its regionally destabilising behaviour. Both Iran and North Korea are supplying Russian forces in Ukraine as we speak. And China is adopting a more aggressive stance in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. Together, this axis of authoritarian states are increasingly working together to undermine democracies and reshape the world order. And in these circumstances, our alliances take on ever greater importance. And so I commend the Prime Minister on his work with our closest allies at both the NATO summit in Washington and the European Political Community meeting here at Blenheim. Across this House, we built a strong consensus on foreign policy in the last Parliament, and this has stood our country in good stead in this transition. Our allies, particularly Ukraine, know that whilst our government has changed, Britain remains an active, involved and reliable partner. Now, I'm glad that the Prime Minister also shares our view of the value of the EPC community as a forum. I'm pleased and welcome the fact that he did use the summit to discuss illegal migration, because it is one of the most pressing problems facing our entire continent. And when it comes to illegal migration, we all face the same fundamental question: how to deal with people who come to our countries illegally whilst respecting our international obligations. Because, of course, it's not feasible or right to return Afghans to the Taliban, or Syrians to Assad, or Iranians to the Ayatollahs. But nor can our countries accommodate everyone who would like to leave Afghanistan, Syria or Iran and come here. So I was pleased to hear the Prime Minister say that he was a pragmatist and that he will look at what works when it comes to squaring this circle. And I would urge him, in his conversations with other European leaders, to keep the option of further third country migration partnerships on the table, as other countries have been discussing. Now, I know the Prime Minister is also interested in pursuing a security and defence cooperation pact with the European Union. And here I just urge him to be alert to the trade-offs involved in this, and I hope he can reassure the House that any closer cooperation with the EU will not adversely affect the technological and procurement aspects of our other alliances, such as AUKUS. Because, of course, we're a pillar of European security, as our leadership on Ukraine has shown, but we also have alliances and interests that extend beyond the European continent. To turn next to the NATO summit, it was good to see the alliance reaffirming its commitment to Ukraine, with the UK at the heart of that leadership. And I hope the Prime Minister will keep the House updated on how the new unit to coordinate our collective support to Ukraine will indeed lead to an increase in vital support. And I would urge the Prime Minister to continue stressing to our allies that now is the moment to increase, not pare down, our backing for Ukraine, just as the UK has continued to lead in. Now, in 75 years of its existence, NATO has established itself as the most successful defensive alliance in history. The best way to strengthen the alliance is for the non-American members of the alliance to do more, to show that we do not expect the Americans to bear every burden. And I welcome the Prime Minister's indication that the Chancellor will soon set out a clear path to investing 2.5% of GDP in our armed forces, I hope by 2030. Because this would both show the Americans that the other members of the alliance are serious about boosting our own capabilities, but also show President Putin and our adversaries that we are serious about defending our borders and our allies from any Russian or other aggression. The Prime Minister also spoke about the situation in the Middle East, and we all want to see progress towards a two-state solution. where Israelis and Palestinians can both live side by side in peace, prosperity and security. But as we make progress towards that goal, our friend and our ally Israel must have the right to defend itself against the threat that it is facing. A threat demonstrated by the drone strike on Tel Aviv at the end of last week by the Iranian-aligned Houthi rebels. So in conclusion, let me thank the Prime Minister for coming to the House today to update us. I can assure him that on these benches, we will work with him on these questions of foreign policy and national security. We will ask questions, we will probe, we will push for answers. That is our duty as the official opposition. But we will always act in the national interest and work constructively with him to ensure the security of our country.
Can I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his welcome comments in relation to President Biden? I'm sure will be well received. And what he said about the consensus on foreign policy in relation to NATO and the EPC. I do think that's important, and I'm glad that we managed to get that consensus over recent years, because we are in a more volatile world, and the world is looking in to see unity in the United Kingdom. That is particularly so in relation to Ukraine. And I have commended the role of the previous government in relation to Ukraine, do so again, and took the deliberate decision when I was Leader of the Opposition not to depart on Ukraine, because I took the view and continue to take the view that the only winner in that circumstances is Putin, who wants to see division. And I think that it's very important for Ukraine to see that continued unity across this House. We will, of course, work with others. And in relation to the particular point, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, old habits die hard. The point that the Leader of the Opposition put me on security and cooperation with our EU allies, I do believe that's for our mutual benefit, but I can assure him and the House that that does not cut across or come at the cost of other alliances, and we're fully committed to AUKUS, something I was able to make clear in opposition, and I take this early opportunity to affirm in government, because again I think it's an area where there's important consistency across the House. And in relation to the conflict in Gaza, I think the more that we can be united in this House, the better. It is an issue of great complexity, but I do think that the approach that has been shown is the right approach, and we take it forward in that spirit. Thank you very much.
Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on his flying start on the world stage, and for his determination to build not simply a rules-based order, but a rights-based order, rooted in what Churchill called the Great Charter and we call the European Convention on Human Rights. We want its freedoms and liberties to be enjoyed by the people of Ukraine, but that will take victory over Russia. That will need more than courage. It will need resources. So did the Prime Minister discuss with colleagues internationally the need not simply to freeze Russian assets, but to seize Russian assets and to put them to work in defeating once and for all the tyranny of President Putin?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. The centrality of the Ukraine issue, yes, of course, it requires resource, it requires more pressure in relation to sanctions, but it requires resolve. And one of the key issues coming out of the NATO Council in Washington was a real sense of, particularly in relation to Ukraine, a bigger NATO with more countries than have ever been at the Council before, a stronger NATO, but also a unity of resolve when it came to standing up to Russian aggression, particularly in Ukraine. And therefore, whether it's resources or sanctions, they were central to the agenda there. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of the statement. Closer cooperation with our European neighbours is absolutely essential, whether it's Russia's illegal war against Ukraine or tackling the criminal gangs responsible for the small boats crisis, and I welcome the new government's change in approach on this. I also welcome, Mr. Speaker, the new government's support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Clearly, we need to put an end to the humanitarian devastation there, get the hostages home, and open the door to a two-state solution. Upholding international law is also crucial, And to that end, I hope the government will respect the ruling of the ICJ last week when it considers it. Coming on to the NATO summit, 70 years on from the foundation of NATO, the alliance has never been more relevant. And we support the NATO summit pledge of long-term security assistance for Ukraine, as well as increased support now to ensure she can resist Russia's attacks and liberate her territory. I am pleased that in this new Parliament, this House will continue to stand united behind the brave Ukrainians opposing Russia's illegal war, just as we've done together in recent years. But I hope that members of this House will not be complacent about the impact that the upcoming US elections could have on the security of not just the UK and our allies, but Ukraine too. We must hope that the leadership of President Biden continues with his successor, and I'd like to echo the Prime Minister's tribute to President Biden. But whatever happens in the US, part of the answer is for the UK and Europe to increase defence spending. The previous Conservative government has left a legacy of the smallest army since the age of Napoleon and played fast and loose with public money, making our shared ambition of 2.5% of GDP for defence spending a much more complicated route. And we look forward to the Chancellor Exchequer's plan. I hope that this government will start by reversing the planned cuts to the army of 10,000 troops. This is a vital first step. So will the Prime Minister reassure the House and the country that this will be a priority within the recently launched Strategic Defence Review? We also urge the government to move further and faster in taking steps to seize the frozen Russian assets, of which there are £20 billion worth on our shores and the same amount on the continent. I hope that he will recognise that we have an opportunity to lead within Europe on this vital issue. If the US cannot, Europe must.
Thank you very much. On the three issues, firstly, on the international court, we do respect the independence of the court and international law, and let me be very clear about that. I won't get tempted into questions about the US elections later this year, save to say that it will obviously be for the American people to decide who they want as their president, and as you would expect, we will work with whoever is the president after they've made their choice. On the question of troop numbers, I take the point about the low numbers of troops. That will be looked at in the Strategic Defence Review that we're carrying out into threats, capability and resources. Thank you.
Dr. Rupa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was incredibly pleasing to see the Prime Minister both at NATO and welcoming leaders from across our continent to Blenheim Palace in a historic moment for a reset with Europe after the disastrous legacy that the departing government left behind. Can I ask, did the subject of youth mobility for students and such like arise? And could his government look into repairing this for its soft power, cultural exchange and growth-boosting properties that have been so valued as we're now in a post-Erasmus era?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Look, the reset with our European allies was well received. And there was clearly an appetite to work in a different and better way with the UK, and I think that will stand us in good stead as we go forward. We did have discussions about a closer relationship with our EU allies, but I made it very clear from the outset, as I have done in opposition, that does not mean rejoining the EU, that does not mean going back into the structures of the EU, and it does not mean freedom of movement. And I took the early opportunity to make that clear to our European allies so that we can move forward progressively, but with the right framework in mind. Thank you.
Sir Julian Lewis.
May I congratulate the Prime Minister on his election victory, and particularly on the very strong commitment he gave at the beginning of his campaign to the maintenance of the strategic Trident nuclear deterrent in the future. Does he agree with me that if an organisation like NATO had existed in 1914 or in 1939, which committed America to the protection from day one of countries like Belgium in the one case or Poland in the other, those two terrible conflicts might well never have broken out? And does he therefore share my concern that the virus of isolationism is once again on the move in certain parts of the American political spectrum?
Thank you for that question. Firstly, I was able to make clear our unshakable commitment to the nuclear deterrent, something I did in opposition. I've been able to make absolutely clear as Prime Minister, and it was very important that I did so from the outset. In relation to what may have happened in the past, I won't speculate, but I do believe that NATO is the most successful alliance the world has ever known, and that it is as needed now as it was when it was founded. The Labour then government was very proud to be a founder member of NATO, and it was very important for me to reaffirm our unshakable support for NATO. The world is a more volatile place. The challenges are greater now than they've been for many years, and I think that NATO is as needed now and as relevant now as it's ever been in its history. Thank you.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for the leadership he showed not just at NATO but the European political community. Working together and collaborating is important, not least in an unstable world that we're in. Could he set out for the House what discussions he had about the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement in the light of its renegotiation deadlines next year?
Thank you. I was able to have early discussion about the EU-UK trade arrangements of a preliminary sort. There is an appetite for that discussion. Nobody pretends that it's an easy discussion, and I'm pleased to have appointed a minister who will take responsibility for that important work. It does not involve rejoining the EU. It does involve resetting and improving the relationship we have with our EU allies. Thank you.
Sir Julian Smith.
Congratulate the Prime Minister on his election win and wish him the very best in his new role. Building on the last question, the EPC summit seemed very positive. How does he see using this political locus to get the UK in the best possible position for the renegotiation of the TCA in 2026?
I thank the honourable member for his comments. I do think that there is an appetite now for a different discussion about our future relations with the EU, whether that's trade, whether that's education and research, or whether it's security cooperation. I think particularly in light of what's happened in Ukraine, there is a shared sense that there's room for closer work and closer ties there. So they're the three main areas. It's at very early stages, but the reset was very well received by very many European allies, and I was very pleased to have that early opportunity to set out our case. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's statement will be warmly welcomed by the people of Rochdale, particularly the Ukrainian community which has flourished in our town for nearly 80 years. So can I pass on to him a direct message from Olga Kurtunik, who is the chair of the Rochdale branch of the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain, who told me yesterday she's very, very grateful for the Prime Minister's continued support for President Zelensky in the fight against this illegal war that Putin waged.
Yeah. Well, I'm very pleased to hear that and to be able to make that clear commitment. But I do want to emphasise this is the continuation of the work of the previous government, which we fully supported before and fully support now, and therefore I think what is also important for our communities and certainly important for the international community is to see the unity that we've been able to maintain here in this chamber. The world watches in relation to our unity, and it's very important therefore that we maintain it as we go forward. Thank you.
Stephen Giffins.
Mr. Speaker, can I add my personal congratulations to the Prime Minister on this election win as well. Mr. Speaker, the international rules-based system is the cornerstone of peace and security. When the Prime Minister talks of a ceasefire in Gaza and implication of the rule of law, what measures is he willing to take to make sure that's implemented? And furthermore, being outside the EU makes us less safe. The populists who want us to turn away from the EU and towards Trump-style isolationism are playing straight into Putin's hands. So what are we doing to get closer to the EU?
Well, on both those points, firstly, in relation to a ceasefire, obviously talks are underway at quite an advanced stage, and we have already urged all sides in the international discussions that I've had to move forward on a ceasefire, because without a ceasefire it's very difficult to envisage the circumstances in which further hostages can come out safely, aid can go in the scale that's desperately needed, but also a ceasefire can be a foot in the door for the beginning of a process, however remote it may seem at the moment, to a two-state solution. In relation to the EU, look, we've got a shared interest in safety and security with our EU allies, and that was very much the topic of discussion we had at the EPC summit last week.
Josh Simons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For my constituents in Makerfield, restoring control over our borders is a key issue of concern. It's become a matter of public trust. Does the Prime Minister agree that the new Border Security Command is an opportunity to show how the UK can play a leading role in tackling criminal smuggler gangs?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I do. And the command is based on the work that I did as Director of Public Prosecutions, working with law enforcement, security, intelligence sharing with our allies in the cases I was working on to deal with counter-terrorism. And I've never accepted the argument that the only gangs that apparently can't be taken down using the same techniques are the gangs that are running this vile trade. There was a real interest in what we were saying at the EPC summit last week, and an understanding that if we do share intelligence, data, strategy and approach, that we can all do more to bring down these vile gangs. Thank you.
Sir John Whittingdale.
May I welcome the Prime Minister's reiteration that the UK remains the strongest supporter of Ukraine against Russian aggression. But can he say what support we can also give to another former Soviet state, Armenia, both in resolving its conflict with Azerbaijan, but also in pursuing its ambition to move closer to NATO and to the European Union in the face of Russian threats and intimidation?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. This did come up in the discussions last Thursday, as would have been expected, with a joint resolve to provide the support that is needed, the framework that is needed for peace and security across the entire region. And that is something where I do think, again, there's a shared intent with our allies to work together on it, because it is of such importance. Thank you for raising it.
Fred Thomas.
I'm one of 12 newly elected members on this side of the House who've served in the armed forces. And in Plymouth, so many of my friends and neighbours have served as well. And all of us are deeply concerned by the ongoing illegal invasion and inhumane, increasingly barbaric tactics that Russia is using. Will the Prime Minister agree with me that in an uncertain world, one thing we can be sure of is that Ukraine has got no firmer friend than the UK?
Yes, I can confirm that and emphasise just how important it is. We did have the honour of hosting President Zelensky at Downing Street on Friday, where I was able to make that clear, but again to take the opportunity that we were building on the work of the previous government, not departing from that work, and I think the support of the UK in particular to Ukraine has been leading, it's been important, it's been provided at difficult times, which has often led to others moving in accordance to the moves that we have made as a country. And President Zelensky is grateful for the role that we have played in the past and that we continue to play now.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
My constituents in Sleaford and North Wycombe are very concerned about levels of illegal migration, and particularly people crossing the Channel. And I was pleased to hear the Prime Minister say that he wants to tackle it. He mentioned two measures, £84 million to tackle root causes, and he also mentioned the focus, which arguably is already present, on law enforcement. There were 1,500 people cross the Channel in the last 7 days. How many of those people would he expect to have been deterred by the measures he described?
Well, I'm grateful for the question. This is a real problem that we've inherited because not enough attention has been paid to border control, in my view. Record numbers have come this year, and the measures that have been taken by the last government were patently not working. So we need to address that. That's why we've taken early steps to set up the Border Security Command. It's also why we've already moved more staff into the returns unit so it can get on with the job of actually returning those that have no right to be here. 100 staff moved already in the early days of this government. But we do have to recognise that we also need to address the reasons that people move in the first place, which is very much to do with conflict, to do with poverty and to do with climate change. And if we ignore those upstream causes, then we will never fully get to grips with the problem which is so obvious to so many people in this country.
Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Prime Minister for his statement. I want to thank him particularly for his commitment to resetting our relationship with the European Union. It is with regret that the deal signed by the party opposite when they were in government did real damage to our economy, put up barriers to trade with the European Union and increased red tape. Will the Prime Minister agree with me that now is the time for a new relationship and to take practical measures to increase our alignment with the European Union, such as the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, so we can help our services and get our economy moving again?
I thank my honourable friend for those questions. Look, I don't think the deal we've got is good enough. I think if you talk to any business that deals with the EU, they would complain that it's not good enough for them. It's made trade harder, not easier, and that's a real problem. So we can do better than that. And the EPC was an early opportunity for us to reset our relationship and begin progress towards that better relationship, whether it's in relation to trade or defence and security, which are both very, very important to us. Thank you.
Liz Roberts.
And I welcome that the Prime Minister says that there is an appetite for a reset in our relationship with our European neighbours. And of course, a core element of collective European security is collective economic security. He knows that being outside the single market and the custom union has cost the UK economy almost £140 billion. So how will he remedy this toxic Tory legacy by continuing to refuse even considering rejoining these economic structures?
I do think the relationship can improve. I think we can have a better relationship, but I don't think we can simply ignore the referendum and go back into the EU. And in the discussions I had with our European allies, none of them were urging us to take that course. They were interested in the argument we were making about a better relationship and how that can work in relation to trade, in relation to education, in relation to security and defence. And that's why I wanted to be very clear from the outset what our approach is. Thank you.
Joe Morris.
Mr. Speaker, the Hexham constituency, as the Prime Minister will know, is proudly home to the Holborn Rangers, which has played a key role in training our armed forces for decades. I'd like to know what steps the Prime Minister will take to improve the working relationship between our armed forces and those of our NATO allies.
Well, I'm grateful for that question. Our armed forces provide huge resource to NATO, particularly in Europe, and of course fully committed in almost every respect to NATO across our armed forces. So I think there's huge room for further such work, building on what is clearly working already. Thank you.
Maltos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has given us fine words about the importance of our membership of international institutions and in particular international courts, and I agree with him. It's profoundly in our national interest that we're a member of these organisations. But he will know as well as I that those courts are only as good as the action and consequence that flows from their judgment. Without action and consequence, then their judgments just become hot air. So in relation to Israel-Gaza, and in particular the occupation of the West Bank, could he please assure us that he's considering hard consequences for the very obvious flagrant breach of international law that's taking place on a daily basis in that part of the world?
I'm grateful for that question because I believe in international law, and I think it's very important that we keep to our commitments in international law. We're known for that as a nation, and it matters to the world. In relation to the courts, I respect their independence. Obviously, we will have robust discussion about the particular judgments or actions that they might publish and decisions that they come to. But it is important, if you believe in international law, to be equally clear that we support the independence of the courts. Without that anchor, then we do not have the framework that is so important to us in terms of enforcing international law. Thank you.
Adam Joji.
And I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and very much echo his words about President Biden. Does the Prime Minister agree with me and the people of Newcastle-under-Lyme that the only way to stop illegal migration and the subsequent tragic loss of life is by our United Kingdom working closely and more closely with our European neighbours to smash the gangs who run this vile trade?
Yes, I do. And we've already been able to put further resource into Europol. And the discussions we had about sharing data and intelligence, an overarching strategy on prosecutions, was a very live discussion last Thursday with our European allies who were keen to learn more about what we were proposing and how they could play their part with us to smash the gangs. Because they operate across borders, this can only be done in conjunction with and collaboration with our EU partners.
Richard Ford.
Yeah. The last government spent quite some time engaging with isolationists in Washington. They sought to influence conservative think tanks in the US that are listened to by Republicans, such as the Heritage Foundation. I appreciate the point that the Prime Minister makes that it is for the American people to decide who governs them later this year. Yet, what more can his government do to stress to Republicans and to candidate Trump that European and American security are indivisible?
Well, in relation to the first part of the question, luckily I don't answer for the last government, I answer for this government. On the question, look, we will work with whoever the American people elect in as president, but and specifically on the question, the relationship, the special relationship between the UK and the US is, it was forged in the most difficult of circumstances. It's endured for many years, and I think it is important both to the US and the UK to maintain that special relationship. I've had the early opportunity to make my position clear on this, which again is a continuation of the position of the last government, and that special relationship matters to us, whoever ends up being the President of America.
Sally Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree with me that we need a NATO-first defence policy in the face of growing Russian aggression like we've seen in Ukraine? And will he also join me in paying tribute to the Doncaster Ukrainian Centre in my constituency, who have worked around the clock and tirelessly to support Ukrainian refugees, demonstrating the true community spirit of Doncaster?
Yeah. Well, let me start by joining in that and making it clear how important that work that's done in so many communities is really important in terms of the support that is shown and the welcome actually it's shown as well to refugees. In relation to the point about NATO first, this is very important. As I say, we're very proud to have been the founding members among the founding members of NATO, and the review that we've put into place does have framework principles, one of which is NATO first, so that will inform the way in which we conduct the strategic review. Thank you.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Why do we continue to limit Ukraine's ability to take the fight to Russia?
Well, the approach to capability which has been provided from the UK remains the same now as it was 3 weeks ago. So no different decisions have been taken based on the principles of recognising Ukraine's right to self-defence and the parameters of international law. I think that's right, and that's why no new decisions have been taken in relation to that.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister agree with me that the strength and unity of purpose expressed by our international alliances is mirrored and indeed enhanced by the solidarity with which the British people have shown friendship in accommodating Ukrainians in this country? And would he join me in praising the work of the Rugby Ukrainian community and assuring me that his government will continue to support such groups going forward?
Yes, on both points. I was very struck a number of months ago when I was in Swindon with Ukrainian women who were leading some of the workshops on businesses and success and the incredible contribution they were making. On the main point about the attitude of the British people, it was really good to be able to say to President Zelensky, as I did, that we've just had an election and that we've been all over the United Kingdom, and pretty well wherever he went, you saw the Ukrainian flag and people supporting Ukraine, irrespective of party political differences. There was a real sense that the whole country, as well as the government and the opposition here, support Ukraine and are determined to do whatever they can to stand up to Russian aggression. And I think we should be really proud of the fact that we see that right across the country.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate the Prime Minister on the office he's achieved and thank him for the statement he's given today, and I'm pleased with the decision to remain as part of the European Convention on Human Rights. In all the meetings he's had with both the EU and NATO, was the issue of global war considered? The issues not just of the wars in Ukraine and Palestine, but also in Sudan, in Congo and Yemen, and the possibilities of involving the UN much more in looking towards a more peaceful future rather than a continued greater expenditure on arms. And if we are to follow the role of international law, whilst I'm pleased that he's called for a ceasefire in Gaza, surely it needs to go a bit further and call for the withdrawal of Israeli occupying forces in both Gaza and the West Bank, and an end to our complicity by the supplying of arms to Israel.
Order. Can I just gently say to Honourable Gentleman, I've got a lot more to get in as well. As important as his message is, I need to make others heard. Prime Minister.
Let me deal with both points. Firstly, in relation to conflict resolution, yes, that did come up because we had a very full discussion about illegal migration, about the law enforcement aspect of it, as I've explained, but also about the root causes of migration, conflict, poverty and climate change being key among them. In relation to a ceasefire, look, the prospect of a ceasefire is there. I'm urging all parties to take that opportunity, which is an important foot in the door for the political process that I believe is the only process that's going to bring about lasting peace and resolution in the Middle East, which is why it's so important.
Katie White.
I congratulate the Prime Minister on clearly a very successful set of meetings over the last week. But can I ask my right honourable friend, does he agree that the shift in relationship with the European Union led by the previous government has indeed made us economically poorer and undermined small businesses like the toy shop in my constituency in Horsforth, which closed? Can I ask, will he ensure that small businesses and their needs and prosperity will be at the heart of any renegotiation deal in 2 years' time?
Well, I'm grateful for that question. Look, there are businesses across the country who are dealing with Europe who do feel that the deal that this government, the last government, negotiated is not good enough for them, and it's made trading much harder for them, which is why they're encouraging of us to reset that relationship and make sure that we get a better deal. It will be better for our country, be better for our businesses and better for our economy, and our number one mission in government is to grow our economy, and so it's very important to be seen in that context as well.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Blow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate the Prime Minister too on what has obviously been a successful series of meetings last week. He set out some of his new policies to deal with illegal migration across the Channel today and return illegal migrants from this country. Over what sort of timescale could the British people reasonably expect his new policies to start have a real effect on these issues?
Well, we've taken early measures because I know that the British people want to see the impact, they want to see a difference. And they do feel very much that in recent years there's been a loss of control of the borders, and that is a matter of border security and actually a matter of national security. So that is why we've acted quickly to begin the steps to set up the Border Security Command. That is why we've already begun to put more staff in the returns unit and taken a decision in relation to the upstream work that is needed to reduce the likelihood of migration in the first place. They are early steps. I'm not going to put an arbitrary date on it, but I do understand the thrust of the question, which is that this is an area of great importance where the British people want to see a material change in the situation as it now is.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Gateshead Central and Wickham and across the North East, those who have fled Putin's war in Ukraine want to make the most of their time in our community. But above all, they want to know that the British people stand with them. So I thank the Prime Minister for his ongoing support for the people of Ukraine. But can he expand further on Ukraine's future entry into NATO, which is so critically important?
Yes, I can. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do so. The NATO Council committed itself to an irreversible path to membership of NATO. That is a material step forward from a year ago, and it's among the reasons that President Zelensky said that the Council was a success in relation to membership of NATO. And that's why I said what I'd said in my statement, but now that path is irreversible, and that is a good thing, welcomed across the NATO allies. Thank you.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The level of infiltration by Hamas into UNRWA is well documented. From UNRWA staff taking part in the pure evil that was the 7th of October attack, to UNRWA-funded schools being used to store weapons and harbour terrorists, to terror infrastructure being found under UNRWA's own headquarters in Gaza City. So can I ask the Prime Minister, before he took the decision to recommit UK taxpayers' money to UNRWA, what advice did he receive on that infiltration, and what steps has he demanded that UK taxpayers' money can never, ever be used to fund terror or preach hate?
Well, as the honourable member would expect, we took the most careful advice and subjected it to the most careful consideration, because we were concerned, as anyone in this House would be concerned, by the suggestions and allegations in relation to October the 7th. So we took that really carefully, very seriously, with the utmost consideration. There has, of course, been an independent review and steps put in place, but there is a vital role for UNRWA. Many other countries have restored funding for UNRWA. It is the right thing to do, but I can give an assurance that the most careful consideration was given before that step was taken, as the honourable member would have expected.
Joe Powell.
Mr. Speaker, can I warmly welcome the announcement that the UK will lead an initiative to crack down on Russia's shadow fleet of sanctions-evading ships that are helping generate dirty money to fund their war machine? And will the Prime Minister continue to make sanctions enforcement a priority and update this House on the state of international negotiations to utilise frozen Russian assets, including those in Kensington and Bayswater, to support Ukraine now?
Well, I'm grateful for that question, and I think there was important progress at NATO in relation to sanctions, and I do think it's important for the House to have regular updates, and therefore we can commit to give her the next update as soon as it's appropriate to do so. But I think across the House there is a resolve to use sanctions as effectively as they can be used as one of the weapons in relation to Russian aggression. Thank you.
Colin Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Prime Minister enjoyed welcoming fellow European leaders to Blenheim Palace in my constituency. One of my constituents, Rose, is currently studying Spanish and French at Southampton University. She would like to spend her year abroad working in Spain to strengthen her language skills and improve her employment prospects. Yet, as it stands, she has no right to work there. I hope the Prime Minister saw the benefit of working with his European counterparts and perhaps making a few new friends. I hear his response on not rejoining the political structures, but as a specific measure to improve the opportunities for young people, will he open talks with the European Union on a youth mobility scheme?
Well, it was very good to be in the honourable member's constituency at Blenheim Palace, and I can't tell him how many European leaders said to me that they had previously visited usually whilst they were studying in the UK, but only paid the £5 to get into the grounds because they hadn't had the money to get into the building, which they were then entering, which was a common theme. On the substance of his question, look, we're not returning to freedom of movement, but I do understand the desire of people to work in other countries. But look, I need to be clear, there's no rejoining the EU, there's no rejoining the single market or the customs union or return to freedom of movement. But I do believe there's a better deal that we can work on. And I think that the more we can work across the House on that, the better, because then it will be the more enduring.
Peter Swallow.
Speaker. As the proud home of the RMA Sandhurst, my constituency knows the vital importance of our armed forces in keeping Britain safe. So I warmly welcome the government's commitment to setting out a path to 2.5% GDP spending on defence. Can the Prime Minister update us on conversations he's had with our NATO friends and allies to encourage others to match this target?
Well, I'm proud of the commitment we already make to NATO over the 2%, and we did have a discussion at the NATO Council, as you'd expect, on the need for all NATO members to make that contribution and to increase their contribution, and there was a commitment to do so. Our commitment to 2.5% will be set out, the path to it will be set out by the Chancellor of the future fiscal event. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in seeking to reset Britain's relationship with the European Union, can the Prime Minister confirm that his government will not accept EU rules automatically applying in Britain unless they have been specifically agreed by this Parliament?
Yes.
Oliver Ryan.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for the leadership that he's shown in his discussions at Blenheim, especially on NATO? I'm proud to see the Prime Minister recommit us to a two-state solution in the Middle East and to an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Does he agree with me that this conflict is urgent and dire, but needs sober and considerate solutions rather than extreme rhetoric from those who might seek to sow further divisions?
Yes, I do, and I'm grateful for that question, because there is the prospect of a ceasefire. It is desperately needed for the reasons we've already discussed. It will only happen if there's international agreement and a sober assessment that provides the framework for the remaining hostages to be released. I shudder to think of the state of some of them. For the aid desperately to be allowed in at the scale it's needed, and for beginning of the process, in my view, the only process that will lead to a lasting resolution of this awful conflict. And I think that it's all of our, not just interest, but duty to do everything we can to ensure that that comes about.
That completes the first statement. I'll let the front bench change over.